right, we're letting people in. Thank you for waiting. Got a great program today. And so we just want to get started. I'm going to say hello to everyone. Welcome to the May meeting of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I hope your day is going well. I hope you're enjoying some of this beautiful weather like we're having in Michigan. I'm Glenda Bullock. I'm the program chair of the CHAA, and our speaker today is Laura Shapiro. She's a journalist, author, and culinary historian, and she's going to be talking about her book, What She Ate: 6 Remarkable Women and the Food That Tells Their Stories. Our online host for the program today is the Ann Arbor District Library. They provide promotional and tech support for us on Zoom, and we are ever so grateful to them for that. I imagine everyone now knows how Zoom works, but if you don't want your face to show during the recording of this program, please turn off your video and your microphone will be muted during the talk, but Laura will take questions at the end as time allows. You can post your questions and comments in the chat, and then select the Ann Arbor District Library as the recipient of your chat, and then we will moderate the questions and feed them to her at the end. One more tip: at the top right of your screen, there's a little button that says view, and if you click speaker view instead of gallery view, you'll have a much better viewing experience. For any newcomers who are tuning into our program today, we'd like to give you a little information about our organization. The Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor are an informal group of people. We are interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. We have monthly talks between September and May. Since September of 2020, we've been meeting on Zoom, and we are looking forward to the day when we can meet again in person. But until then, we are taking advantage of the library's there we go. We're taking advantage of the library's generosity and hosting speakers from around the country, including today's presenter, who is in New York. We have twice yearly potluck theme meals, and although we've had to cancel them a few times lately, we're going to try again this July. So if you're a member of the CHAA, you will be getting an invitation from us soon, probably this week. If you're not a member of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, we would love to have you join. It costs $25 a year to be a member for an individual or a family, and this includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast, which is edited by Randy Schwartz. So if you'd like to join our group, you can find membership information on our website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and then just click on membership, and you can even join online. So now I would like to introduce today's speaker. Laura Shapiro was a columnist at the Real Paper in Boston before beginning a 16-year run at Newsweek, where she covered food, women's issues, and the arts, and won several journalism awards. Her first book was Perfection Salad: Women in Cooking at the Turn of the Century, which was published in 1986, and the University of California reissued it in 2009 with a new afterword. She is also the author of Something from the Oven: Reinventing Dinner in the 1950s America, which was named in the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best books on American food. And she also wrote Julia Child, Penguin Lives, in 2007, which won the award for literary food writing from the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Her latest book is What She Ate: 6 Remarkable Women and the Food That Tells Their Stories, which Susan Stamberg of NPR called seriously and hilariously researched culinary history. That's the book she will be discussing today. So it's my great honor to welcome Laura Shapiro.
Thank you, Glenda. It is such a pleasure to be speaking to this group. I love Ann Arbor, who does not? And I have to say, ever since I published What She Ate, and I've been speaking about it here and there, it has been such a treat to talk about this book to people with a particular interest in culinary history. So much of this project was about research. It was about how you interact with the materials that you unearth, how you get them to talk, how you get them to tell stories they may never have told before. So I always feel when I speak to culinary historians that I can say anything because you get it. You've been there, you know this obsession. So thank you very much for having me here. Of course, I wish that it were in the real world and not in the screen world, but the screen world, I guess, is what we have. I want to start by telling you about a woman who is not in my book, but she is somebody who was with me every single day while I was working on it. Her name was Inez Haynes Irwin. She grew up in Boston at the end of the 19th century in a big extended family. They were not rich, but they were educated, so they would have been called genteel. She went on to become a successful writer, but her passion in life was the suffrage movement. She's very involved in the struggle for the vote and later on deeply involved in women's politics. 1926, she wrote an autobiographical essay for The Nation magazine on why she became a feminist. She called it The Making of a Militant. I have never forgotten this essay because in it, she zeroed in on dinner. Every Sunday, she wrote, her sisters, her brothers, aunts, and uncles, they all gathered at the table for a big roast beef dinner. This was a ritual event that always took place in the middle of the day on Sunday. So think about that. Today, we revere family meals. We see them as a support system for childhood itself. These are the charmed events where love, taste, and tradition begin their all-important journey through our lives. Back in the 19th century, of course, there is nothing noteworthy about a family dinner on Sunday except that they were inevitable. Young Inez loathed them. She wrote, as I look back on those years, the midday Sunday dinner seemed in some curious way to symbolize everything that I hated and dreaded about the life of the middle-class woman. That plethoric meal, the huge roast, the blood pouring out of it as the man of the house carved, the many vegetables all steaming the heavy pudding. And when the meal was finished, the table a shambles that positively made me shudder, the smooth, replete retreat of the men to their cushioned chairs, their Sunday papers, their vacuous nap, while the women removed all vestiges of the horror. Sunday noon dinners, they set a scar upon my soul. Well, I loved that when I came across it. And those of you who are planning to write your food memoirs, and I know you are out there, believe me, this is the kind of thing you want. Sunday noon dinners, they set a scar upon my soul. So little Inez, sitting at that table week after week, vowed that she would never learn to cook. She would have a career and she would earn the money to pay somebody else to do the cooking. And that's exactly what happened. She wrote very popular children's books and she worked at her profession right through 2 marriages, the second one happy. She said nothing else about food in this Nation essay. Maybe because as an adult, she took no interest in eating, or maybe she considered food unimportant once she herself had slammed the kitchen door. But it was food that set her on her course. It was food that made her a feminist. Every life has a food story. That is what I learned from Inez Haynes Irwin. Years later, it would become my mantra for this book. You don't have to be Julia Child to have a food story. Chefs and cookbook writers, of course, they have food stories. Amateur gastronomes, diligent home cooks, beloved Italian grandmothers who harbor culinary secrets that are passed down over the generations. Yes, they all have food stories, but so does everyone else, even people who don't remember what they ate 5 minutes after the meal. People who are hungry all their lives have food stories. So do people who never have a moment's deprivation. What I mean by a food story isn't just an anecdote, it's more than that. It's a relationship. It's a relationship with what we eat, or wish we could eat, or hate eating, or don't dare to eat, or have forgotten we ever ate. Some relationships with food include cooking, and some don't. Whatever form it takes, this is a relationship that is launched when we're born and it lasts until we die. What an incomparable vantage point on the history of personal life. And what a largely untapped vantage point. Until very recently, people writing biographies or their own autobiographies skipped right past the cooking and the eating. I am sure that some of you who do culinary history have had the same grueling experience I have had, where you're sitting in a library, turning page after fragile page of somebody's papers, hoping against hope she will say something about a meal besides, he stayed for lunch, or after dinner we decided to, or this is my personal least favorite, breakfast didn't take long. Today, of course, popular culture and social media are flooded with all things culinary. Food memoirs are an entire literary genre. Historians looking back on our time will be able to write everybody's food story. But in the realm of more traditional biography and memoir, it is still unusual to find an extended discussion of life at the table, and much less in the kitchen. So when I started to put together the idea for this book, it was not that easy to round up the women. Of course, I thought back to Inez Haynes Irwin. I would have loved to include her. I actually feel kind of guilty that I left her out. What happened was that I tried reading some of these children's books. I couldn't stand them. They were so mawkish. I knew that I would never be able to do her justice. So back she went into the filing cabinet with my heartfelt thanks for writing that essay. A bigger problem was that I didn't want to pack the list with culinary professionals. We know that culinary professionals have food stories. I wanted to look at all kinds of relationships with food, cooks and non-cooks, happy eaters, reluctant eaters, oblivious eaters. Also, I wanted to stand back and look at the whole life of each woman in her time and place from a certain distance. That is, I wanted to write history, not journalism. So everyone had to be dead. At the same time, however, I needed to hear from each woman. She had to talk to me about her life with food, which meant she had to have left some kind of culinary paper trail. And as I said, most people just don't. They put everything in their letters and diaries except what they ate. These relationships with food were elusive. I think even more so than their romantic relationships. If there is a love story hidden somewhere in a woman's papers, it's been kept long buried for the sake of propriety, chances are it will surface eventually. Love is no match for a truly diligent researcher. But if her food story is out of sight, it's probably because she never noticed it in the first place. Look at how Inez Haynes Irwin treated her food story. She didn't actually tell it. She just dropped a few sentences into a brief memoir, and she let the rest of the relationship fall back into the vast realm of the forgotten. Most women wouldn't even do that much. So to dig out some of these lost food stories was what I really wanted to do in this book. Because I was so dependent on the existence of some kind of paper trail, letters, diaries, books, articles, interviews, the women I finally assembled were not ordinary or typical in any way. Ordinary, typical women don't leave us their diaries. Their cousins and their grandchildren don't save their letters. There was no way I could put together a representative sampling of the female sex. Each woman in this book was white. Each was famous in her time. None of them died poor. And yet, there was nothing predictable or pre-packaged about their relationships with food. And that is why I found each of them so gripping. We all know how easy it is. It's practically automatic to associate cooking and eating with our warmest and most accessible emotions. It's love, comfort, pleasure, family, connectedness. And many a woman's food story probably belongs in this category. But what I found in these 6 women, and what kept me fascinated with them during the long haul of working on this book, was that their relationships with food fell into categories that were much harder to define. These stories constantly challenged me. These were stories that were beset with contradictions. They tended to creep around in the shadows. By many measures, these women were happy and successful throughout most of their lives. Yet in every instance, litanies of struggle came to light as soon as I began to poke at the food. The first woman I knew I wanted in the book was Dorothy Wordsworth, the poet's younger sister and his devoted handmaiden. I'm going to talk more about her later. So for now, I will just say that she caught my attention because I happened to be skimming a biography of her and a meal jumped out, but I could not imagine her eating. I know she did eat it because for once she did mention it in a diary. She wrote, "Dined on black puddings." Now, to my mind, there is nothing in Dorothy Wordsworth's daily life, her social class, her health, or her tastes that ever would have hinted she had an appetite for black pudding, which in this instance was not a morsel of boudin noir, would have been a stodgy mess of blood and oatmeal. So the mention of this meal got me wondering, if I could get inside that encounter with black pudding, would I glimpse something about Dorothy that didn't show up on the surface of her life? I knew that she kept a lot of secrets, especially about her attachment to her brother William. This was really an obsession. Scholars have been arguing about it for decades. Dorothy became the first chapter in the book. And she also became the first chapter because it's arranged chronologically. After her comes Rosa Lewis, who was one of the most successful caterers in Edwardian England. She was the only woman in the group who cooked for a living. As I said, I was trying to avoid culinary professionals, but Rosa was irresistible. By the time I started reading about her, her life had already inspired 5 books, plus a PBS series from the 70s, which you may remember, it was called The Duchess of Duke Street. Yet in all this biography and reportage, there was never very much about the food. Everyone was paying far more attention to her personal life, which was, in fact, amazing. Rosa started out as a scullery maid with a Cockney accent. She learned to cook in the Escoffier style, and she cooked her way up the ladder until she was sought after by the best families in England. She became a friend of some of those lords and ladies. She was a favorite of King Edward himself. What's more, she did that without ever losing that Cockney accent. She flaunted it. She wanted to be accepted as who she was, class, identity, and all. It's a great story, but when you look at it food first, you see something else. Rosa thought it was she, accent and all, who had engineered her triumph in society. What she learned in the end was that food can climb the social ladder. It is a lot harder and more treacherous for the cook. Next, I have Eleanor Roosevelt, who appealed to me the moment I learned that the food in the Roosevelt White House was the worst in the history of the presidency. Everybody who ate there was appalled, especially FDR himself, who was a lifelong foodie, and he hated the dried out slabs of meat and the soggy vegetables that he was being served. What's more, he couldn't stand the inept housekeeper who was in charge of the kitchen, Mrs. Nesbitt, whom Eleanor had personally selected for the job and refused to fire. Most historians have assumed that the food was allowed to remain terrible because Eleanor just wasn't interested. She had a sandpaper palate, everyone said. She herself used to say she didn't care what she ate. That explanation did not seem sufficient to me. Eleanor was not only an activist, she was very professional and very responsible about being First Lady. There was a lot that didn't, well, New York is outside with its, just the fire engine. Anyway, there was a lot that did not interest her about this job, the endlessly pouring tea, endlessly making small talk, but she did those things anyway, and she did them well. Why not deal with the food? Sure enough, when I started to explore Eleanor's voluminous paper trail with an eye to what she said about cooking and eating, and when she said it, I found that she did have a palate. She did have an appetite, but she didn't have them in the White House. She had them after the White House, after the president had died, after her very painful marriage was over. That's when she started to perk up around food. During those years, living in New York, she used to ask her cook to make her favorite dessert. It was a kind of layer cake made from crepes piled up with maple sugar between each layer and then maple syrup poured over the top. She used to get the maple syrup herself from Vermont and bring it back. She liked food. She didn't like him. After Eleanor, we come to the only really awful person in this book, and that is Eva Braun, who was Hitler's mistress and briefly his wife. Why Eva Braun? Why include her? I wish I knew. To this day, all I can tell you is once I got the idea, I couldn't shake it. She was such a horrible woman, and she left so little specific evidence of her eating habits that the obstacles to my telling her story were immense. But in the early stages of thinking about this book, I happened to come across an excellent biography of her, very deeply researched by the late British journalist Angela Lambert. That got me hooked. There wasn't much about food, but it pointed me in more directions to read. And the more I explored around her life, I realized that even though Eva had no hands-on role in the machinery of the Third Reich, she played an influential symbolic role, and it was influential because of where it took place, at Hitler's table. She and Hitler were never seen together in public. That was for propaganda reasons. But she was at his side at countless lunches and dinners with the close associates. Family dinners, you'd have to call them. And in this family, Eva was the lady of the house. She was always beautifully dressed. She made a point of being charming and lighthearted. She never talked about politics or the war. She was the image of stereotypical femininity. I think that image, the way she projected everything that was reassuringly female and did so in the particular context of food, had a kind of healing effect. Her presence created a safe space, a guilt-free zone where the Nazis, the torturers and killers at the table could feast on the rightness of their cause. You probably know that Hitler was a vegetarian. Eva was not. She thought his vegetarian meals were disgusting. This was the only thing about him that she objected to. After writing about Eva, I was relieved, I must admit, to move on to Barbara Pym, one of my longtime favorite writers. Pym was a British novelist who published mostly in the 1950s and 60s. She wrote very sharp-eyed, very witty books that are full of food. She didn't think of herself as a food writer, but in a way, that's exactly what she was. Food was a key to character for her. Sitting in a cafeteria or a tea room, she used to take out a little notebook and scribble down what she saw people eating. She was hardwired to notice food. In Lyon's Corner House, this was her favorite place to eat and observe. A young man sits down on a hot day with 3 sausage rolls, a bread roll, baked beans, and chips. She writes it down. A nun standing in front of her in the queue has 2 rolls, a pat of butter, a little dish of honey, and a glass of milk. She writes it down. Her narrators wear sensible cardigans. They go around humming their favorite Anglican hymns, and they cook. In one kitchen, it's bœuf à la mode. In another, it's tinned spaghetti. But put her novels together, and you are getting a tour of post-war British cuisine that goes way beyond tea and Marmite. Now, these were the years when writers like Margaret Drabble and Edna O'Brien were becoming the important women writers of the day. Critics did not know what to make of a woman writer who only set a scene in a bedroom if her characters happened to be there having a cup of late night Ovaltine. Barbara Pym ran into a lot of discouragement in her career. What I love about her, besides the incomparable writing, is that she never lost her faith in food. Finally, we get to Helen Gurley Brown, who was the last person to join this group. I confess, I wanted to scoop her up and write about her the minute I heard she had died. Helen was, of course, the author of Sex and the Single Girl. She also wrote 9 more books just like it. And she was the editor who made publishing history by transforming a half-hearted women's magazine called Cosmopolitan into a phenomenal success that redefined women's journalism. If you've ever seen a picture of Helen Gurley Brown, you know that she was very thin. She loved being very thin. To be thin, as she herself said, was her religion. And throughout her career as writer and editor, she was an ardent evangelist of dieting. In fact, when I started going through her papers, I thought that would be pretty much the entirety of what I would find. All dieting all the time, plus, of course, sex. But it wasn't like that. Helen was definitely obsessed with not eating. She was also obsessed with eating. She wrote constantly and passionately about how much she loved food, how devoted she was to cooking breakfast for her husband. In 1969, she published a 400-page cookbook. She also said many times that she couldn't cook, that eating made her feel guilty, that she would rather go hungry than be full. In other words, what I found was a walking war zone of culinary conflict, plus, of course, sex. Now I want to jump from the end of the book back to the beginning and tell you a little about Dorothy Wordsworth. I have to say right off the bat, she's the only one in this book that Wendy Wolf, my wonderful editor at Viking, begged me not to include. A Nazi? Sure, bring her on. An obscure British novelist? No problem. But she thought there just could not be a compelling food story with a woman whose whole ambition in life, whose only happiness was being the sister of a great poet. And the truth is, I never would have gone looking for a food story in Dorothy Wordsworth, except that I had picked up that biography of her that I mentioned. And I only picked it up because I had insomnia one night and I was desperate for something to read that would put me back to sleep. I thought Dorothy's life would do the trick. To me, she's kind of a folk heroine of English romanticism. She's wafting about this picturesque cottage, tending the hearth and the garden. And that's what I was reading. And I was peacefully starting to doze when suddenly, as I said, this reference to black pudding leaped off the page. I did not fall asleep. I woke up and decided I had to figure this out. Dorothy is most famous for writing what's called the Grasmere Journal, and that fame is justified. It really is a memorable piece of work. The writing glows and the emotional intensity is stunning. People read it with pleasure to this day. I would say it has outlasted a fair amount of what her brother, the great poet, was turning out. She wrote it during the 3 happiest years of her life. This was the period from about 1799 to 1802, when she and William lived together in the beautiful village of Grasmere in the Lake District. When they moved to Grasmere, William was 29, burning to write poetry. Dorothy was 28, burning to help him. And they set up house in a ramshackle little dwelling that came to be known as Dove Cottage. In the journal, she writes about their cozy days and evenings, their garden, their long walks, their neighbors, and she wrote painstakingly about nature, describing the world that was right around them. She was documenting that world for William. Sure enough, he drew on it for his poetry. Dorothy was supremely content with this domestic arrangement, and so was William, but a little less so. And eventually he decided to marry a woman they had both known for many years, Mary Hutchinson. Dorothy wrote all about the wedding. They were in Yorkshire at Mary's house. The night before the wedding, Dorothy put the ring on her own finger and slept with it all night. The next morning, William and Mary went off to the church, while Dorothy waited at home in a state of agitation until she got word that the wedding was over, at which point she passed out cold. Later in the day, William, Mary, and Dorothy all set out together for the 3-day trip back to Grasmere, kind of a family honeymoon. Soon after that, the Grasmere Journal ends. Dorothy cannot write it anymore. She actually stops in the middle of a word. She just puts her pen down. There have been countless warring interpretations of the Grasmere Journal and of Dorothy's whole life. Was she happy as a little flower in the sunshine of family love? Was she crazed and tormented with incestuous passion for William? Does the journal prove tragically that she could never fulfill her promise as a writer because she turned over her time and talent to William? Or does it prove triumphantly that she did fulfill her promise as a writer by producing this journal? So it's a complicated life with an uncertain moral, but it's also a prime example of the way food speaks up, even when the woman herself prefers to keep a few secrets. Looking at Dorothy's food story, you can see it unfolding in 3 scenes. The first is Dove Cottage, her earthly paradise. She and William had a little money from a legacy, but they had to live economically, and they did thanks to Dorothy. They had an elderly servant, but Dorothy did nearly everything herself. The cooking, baking, sewing, laundry, ironing. She made shoes. She did a lot of gardening. She entertained Coleridge and all the other friends who came and stayed for weeks. And she spent hours copying William's poems for him, writing his letters for him, and reading to him. All this shows up in the Grasmere Journal. And as she's recording each day, she drops the food into place, just here and there, what she cooked, what they ate. Reading this journal, it's like watching a mosaic take shape in front of you. It's a mosaic of the quotidian, bit by bit, color by color. The food has exactly the same emotional weight as everything else. She's writing as if everything to do with Dove Cottage is blessed, simply because it's happening there at that time to the 2 of them. Here's what it sounds like. After William had composed a little, I persuaded him to go into the orchard. We walked backwards and forwards, the prospect most divinely beautiful. I went in to put bread in the oven. We borrowed some bottles for bottling rum. The evening somewhat frosty and gray, but very pleasant. I broiled Coleridge a mutton chop, which he ate in bed. We had Mr. Clarkson's turkey for dinner. The night before, we had broiled the gizzard and some mutton and made a nice piece of cookery for William's supper. We had ate up the cold turkey before we walked, so we cooked no dinner. Then we sat by the fire and were happy. Only our tender thoughts became painful. Went to bed at 11:30. And this unforgettable entry, which she wrote after William had to leave on a trip. I have been putting the drawers into order, filed 2 months' newspapers and got my dinner, 2 boiled eggs and 2 apple tarts. Now for my walk. I will be busy. I will look well and be well when he comes back to me. Oh, the darling, here is one of his bitten apples. I can hardly find it in my heart to throw it into the fire. What you notice about the food as it appears and passes in this constant round is that everything they ate was immediate. It was very simple, the food at hand. It was the food of their own circle. She picked the peas from their garden. She took the apples from their orchard. She trained scarlet beans to run up the side of Dove Cottage along with the roses and the honeysuckle. Then she picked the beans and cooked them. Their neighbors brought them gooseberries, apparently by the bushel, judging from the gooseberry pies and tarts she was turning out. She bought bacon from another neighbor. She got gingerbread from the blind man down the street. They got fish from the lake. She baked all their bread. She grew herbs and dried them and hung them in bunches from the kitchen ceiling. The trappings around meals were not important. They got up and went to bed whenever they wanted. They ate any meal at any hour. Nobody ever cut short a walk just because it was time for tea. But the food was important. Dorothy's relation to it was personal and intimate. We were deep in silence and love, a blessed hour, she wrote one evening. We drew to the fire before bedtime and ate some broth for our suppers. Broth, that's it. Hardly a feast, but it was a feast. The second scene in Dorothy's food story is very different. It's really the opposite of paradise. And here is where black pudding makes its appearance. It shows up in a journal Dorothy wrote during the winter of 1828. Now, this is some 25 years after what we've seen. Dorothy had spent those 25 years the way unmarried sisters typically did spend their lives, as an appendage to the family, helping with the house, helping to raise children, serving others. But that job had pretty much ended. The children were grown, and once William became more successful, the family had moved to a big, stately house called Rydal Mount, where they had plenty of servants. Dorothy tried to keep busy, but when she saw a chance to help out in a very direct way, to move back into the center of somebody's life, she jumped at it. William's eldest son, John, was about to take the only job he could get, apparently, which was he was going to be a curate in the distant and dreary town of Whittick in Leicestershire. John was her favorite nephew, so Dorothy volunteered to spend the winter with him, to be his companion, to make his lonely life comfortable. What she envisioned was Dove Cottage all over again. John writing his sermons, she, the loving handmaiden at his side, the person he could not do without. She arrived in November. Soon she was writing home about how busy and happy she was there. But I think you have to read those letters with a grain of salt. And you get that salt in the journal she was keeping at the same time. This was a very simple, almost dry journal. She's just jotting down notes on where she went and whom she saw. It is not beautifully expressive. It's nothing at all like the Grasmere Journal. I think she was using it to tell the truth, to set down facts that didn't make it into the letters. In a letter, for instance, she would say, "The weather is fine. We haven't had a single rainy day." In the journal, she says the weather is gray and rainy. In a letter, she'll write about cozy evenings at home helping John with his sermons. In the journal, she writes about cleaning and laundry. Whittick was in the middle of coal country. Soot was everywhere. The cleaning and laundry went on all the time. I don't think she was lying in these letters. I think she was writing them with rose-colored glasses that actually helped her to see better. That is, they helped her to remember. Strikingly, there is very little about food in this journal. No blessed suppers of broth, no afternoons baking little tarts for William. Dorothy was not, in fact, cooking. John had brought a servant from home, a woman named Mary Dawson, who was known for being what Dorothy called approvingly a right frugal housekeeper. Back at Rydal Mount, they had tried out Mary Dawson as a cook and replaced her immediately. Apparently the food was not up to their standards. But John was a village curate making very little money. So the plain, blunt meals of the sort Mary Dawson was going to produce would be appropriate. Dorothy wrote almost nothing about these meals until a frosty day in January 1829, when she opened her journal, her outlet, you remember, for truth-telling, and wrote, "Dined on black puddings." Black pudding had been a staple of countryside cooking for centuries. It was cheap and ubiquitous, but by the time Dorothy encountered it, it was a dish that had been slipping down the social scale for years and was becoming most closely identified with people known as the common people. If we look at a typical recipe, you can start to see why. Hannah Glass in The Art of Cookery, which first appeared in 1747 and was plagiarized a million times after that, gave directions for a basic no-frills black pudding. First, you take a basin of hog's blood warm from the hog, you add salt and stir it until it cools. Then you add boiled groats, some spices and herbs, and a lot of cut up hog's fat. You stuff the mixture into the intestines, you tie the ends like sausages, and then you boil the puddings, watching out to make sure they don't burst. The first thing you see here is that there is no margin for error. This had to be done right. The warm blood, the cleaning of the intestines, it's a sausage, and as with any sausage, provenance was key. Over the years, more ladylike cookbook authors were urging readers to be very cautious about where their black puddings came from. Mary Radcliffe, writing in 1823, said they could be excellent when properly made, but she felt they were only truly safe to eat in the home of a country gentleman. Buy one from a London butcher, she said firmly, and you will regret it. As a breakfast dish, of course, black pudding still had a respectable pedigree, but by the Victorian era, even this would disappear. Black puddings are not bad in their way, but they are not among the things we would make to set before our friends. This was the advice of Georgiana Hill, author of The Breakfast Book in 1865. I think it's probable that before she got to Whittick, Dorothy had never encountered black pudding except maybe as a breakfast choice at somebody else's house. The family ate plenty of pork in all forms, but black pudding per se never appeared anywhere else in Dorothy's journals or her letters or in the family's recipe collections. She doesn't mention it among the Dove Cottage meals, and it's unlikely to have been served for dinner at Rydal Mount, where the family was living quite a few notches higher in the social scale than they had at Dove Cottage. According to a manuscript recipe book that the family kept in Rydal Mount, they were eating things like raspberry fritters and ginger wine and macaroons. Black pudding would have been an outlier. What's more, it was heavy and notoriously indigestible. Dorothy suffered all her life from what was probably colitis or irritable bowel syndrome. She would have taken one look at black pudding and seen intestinal agony on a plate. So what was it doing there? This unsuitable, indigestible dinner could not have come as a surprise. Dorothy was the mistress of the house. She would have been consulted on the menu. She could have objected, but she didn't. She didn't object to anything in Whittick. She was the only person in the Wordsworth family who didn't describe it as the ugliest, loneliest place in England. On the contrary, she said over and over how happy she was to be there. I am more useful than I could be anywhere else, she said. And that, I think, is the answer. After 25 years as a family appendage, she had been restored to pride of place in somebody else's life. If the price was black pudding, she would pay it joyfully. Actually, I don't think she was tasting black pudding when she cut into it. I think what she tasted was a gooseberry tart. I think when she looked across the table, she saw William. That winter, John got some good news. He was offered a much more appealing job in a nice town not far from Grasmere. He snapped it up. And there went Dorothy's future. She had hoped to spend every winter with her nephew. Now he would need no such help. Once again, she was losing her spot in paradise. Dorothy had arrived in Whittick in perfect health. She was 56. She could walk 15 miles a day easily. When she left at age 57, she was an invalid. Her symptoms, violent pain in her bowels, nausea, vomiting, debilitating weakness, were not unfamiliar to her. She had this history of something like colitis, and she had recorded occasional attacks like this in the Grasmere Journal. But after Whittick, a pattern set in. She would collapse in agony, recuperate, then fall back once more. For the pain, she dosed herself repeatedly with laudanum, which was a tincture made from opium mixed with wine or brandy. It was addictive, and it also affected the brain. She spent the last 20 years of her life helpless and increasingly deranged. This brings us to the last scene of her food story, which took place at Rydal Mount, where family members and servants took care of Dorothy throughout the long years of her illness. They were very long years, certainly for the caregivers. Dorothy was incontinent, so the cleaning and changing went on all day, every day. She could be silent for hours, then burst into profanity. When guests came to stay, they were put in rooms at the opposite end of the house, and they were warned not to be terrified if they heard terrible language coming from Dorothy's room. She insisted on being very warm all the time, so they needed big fires in her room all year round. In the middle of summer, the family found it unbearable to go into her room, plus they're spending a fortune on the coal. Dorothy paid no attention to any of this. In fact, she complained that she was being ignored, that nobody loved her or cared for her. She had spent her whole life serving others. Now she learned what it was like to be served. She was the focus of everyone's attention, the object of everyone's constant worry. She was a sponge to soak up endless amounts of everyone's anxious love. And throughout those 20 years, she ate. Nobody had ever seen her eat so much and so greedily. She was hungry, she kept saying. She wanted more and more. The family was baffled and alarmed. She demanded food constantly. She complained that everyone was depriving her. She said she was never happy unless she was eating. William was distraught. She has a great craving for oatmeal porridge, principally for the sake of the butter that she eats along with it. And butter is sure to bring on a fit of bile sooner or later, he wrote to a friend despairingly. He said he was exhausted from fighting with her about food. She screamed and raged when they denied her anything. One Christmas time, the family received a gift. A friend sent them 2 fresh killed chickens and a turkey. She clasped the turkey to her and hugged it and called it her dearest friend. She said she was going to eat every bit of all the poultry herself. Dorothy had been thin and wiry all her life. Now, for the first time, she grew fat. Back in Dove Cottage, writing her very first entry in the Grasmere Journal, Dorothy explained why she had started this journal. She said that William had just set off on a trip to see Mary Hutchinson. In fact, it was a trip to court Mary Hutchinson, as Dorothy very well knew, but she didn't write about that. She did say that after he left, she burst into tears and then resolved that she would write a journal. I set about keeping my resolve, she wrote, because I will not quarrel with myself. I will not quarrel with myself. To me, this is the leitmotif of Dorothy's whole life. I will not want anything I can't have. I will not be dissatisfied. I will never imagine another life than the one I have. That was her vow, and she stuck to it until she reached the end of the road. After she lost Wittick, I think she just quit. She gave in. She stopped trying to be brave and good and useful. She let herself break down physically and mentally. Then she reemerged at Rydal Mount as someone so unlike Dorothy that people hardly recognized her. One of William's biographers, describing Dorothy greedily clutching this raw turkey to herself, writes, "Nothing more clearly illustrates the loss of the sensibility, which had been the most striking feature of her character." Yes, or you might say she was enjoying a new sensibility to the hilt. William's wife, Mary, wrote to a friend, "It is a comfort to see that she is happy. She has no distress or sorrow that oppresses her more than the transient sorrow of a spoiled child." I don't want to romanticize dementia. It is a horrible disease. But in Dorothy's case, I wonder if it also functioned as a reward she simply claimed for herself. Clearly, she had no intention of ever feeling deprived again. I hope I'm not misreading this third and final scene of her food story, but I have to say, I like thinking of Dorothy in this state, sitting in her chair, round and imperious as royalty, demanding porridge so that she could eat the butter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful explanation of why Dorothy Wordsworth is in your book. Folks, anyone who has any questions, you're very welcome to put them in the chat now, or if you'd like to ask your question in person, you can use the raise hand function on the on your Zoom screen. I wanted to ask you, Laura, if there were you mentioned one woman at the beginning of your talk that you might have wanted to include. I wonder if there were other people, other women you considered in picking these 6. You probably worked from a larger pool.
You know, I did. Most of these women, or some of them kind of came out of my filing cabinet. I had some candidates ready. I tell you, what happened with Eva Braun was sort of something showed me how kind of committed I was to the ones I picked. I was having such a struggle with her that at one point I just threw her out. And I started auditioning some of my other possibilities to see if I could replace her. And that's when I realized what a grip she had on me, because nobody else seemed interesting enough. And of course they were, but I just couldn't land on them. One woman I remember discarding was Annie Fields, who was the wife of the publisher of the company Tickner and Fields in Boston. I had read everywhere she's a notable hostess. People raved about the food at her parties. So I thought, oh, good, this is my lady. And her letters have been published. So I got that book. And of course, there it says right in the middle, it says, of course, we've left out all the stuff about food and all those uninteresting things and just told you, about all the famous people she knew. Excuse me? So it was like that. Even when I landed on someone there, I could not get the material. So it was not a huge field of candidates, I must say.
So Annette Donner wanted to know if you could repeat the name of the fifth woman. She didn't catch it.
Barbara Pym, the writer Barbara Pym, P-Y-M.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite Barbara Pym book?
If you are starting with Barbara Pym, and please do, the great starting place is Excellent Women, which is the book that she's best known for. It was her second novel, but it's like, essence of Barbara Pym. You really get who she was and what the books are like. And then from there, you'll drop it after the first 3 pages. Some people do not have that much of a tolerance for like church jumble sales and things like that, but I do. So give this a try, though, I beg you, if you're interested in food. And this is the thing about these books. We all have this idea of post-war British cooking as the dreariest and most terrible thing in the world. But Barbara Pym was writing about the food that she saw around her. And it was a wide range of, incredibly dreary and bleak and just what you might think, or things that you could find today at Chez Panisse. It was all over the map. So as you see, I recommend this very highly.
Are you familiar with the cookbook that her sister did that was based on her books?
Yes, it's a little bit artificial, the Barbara Pym cookbook. She does bring in some of the recipes and some of the things that Pym wrote about food, but she also puts in, just adds recipes that she thinks would be appropriate. And so, I don't know, it wasn't quite authentic enough for me, so I stayed away from it.
Natalie Cook says, could Laura expand on her provocative comment? I wanted to write history, not journalism, so the women had to be dead.
Yeah, because I did want to write history. That is, I find that writing about anybody who is alive is one set of challenges, and they are very specific. And there are you gain certain things. Obviously, you can ask them anything and they'll talk to you. Yeah. But there's also stuff you can't do. First of all, you don't know the whole picture. You can't, because they're still living their life. So you can only stand back and get a perspective on kind of a snapshot moment. And the other thing is, if you're nice, when I was at Newsweek, I was sort of had the curse of being sort of a nice journalist. You don't want to say anything that's going to hurt anybody's feelings. I mean, I did. I was a critic. I did hurt people's feelings, I'm sure, but you always feel kind of bad about it. If they're dead, you are free. And that I just couldn't resist. I wanted to be able to, first of all, look at everything that there was, and then be able to think more freely. I didn't want that living person to kind of be there, even if she didn't actively pick up the phone and call me. I just knew I didn't want her looking over my shoulder. So it was kind of my personal fetish, basically. Many journalists would not have this set of conditions, but I kind of do.
Another question, why did you choose only women for your book?
Yeah, the truth is, it never occurred to me to include a man, never. Of all the things I thought about in thinking about this book, the idea of including a male, it's like you'd ask me why I didn't include a Martian. It just didn't cross my mind. The book I'm working on currently does have men in it, and it's like a foreign country. It's a real challenge. So yeah, and then the other reason is, I mean, I've always written about women as a journalist and also in my books, and forever I've just written about women. So I feel like it's territory I know and that I can bring something to it. Men, to go that deeply into a man just would have been incredibly hard. How do you know? I mean, they're so weird and different. How do you know anything? So I didn't try.
Another question. Do you think Eleanor was indifferent to the poor White House food at the time and only developed a taste for the food after FDR's death? Or was she consciously serving revenge for FDR's infidelities?
There is a strong argument for the revenge theory. And I think that, Eleanor's great biographer, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, actually calls that chapter of her book, Mrs. Nesbit was Eleanor's revenge. I think there is a lot to that. I don't know if it was conscious. There were so many layers that went into it. I mean, I don't think she had a little list of things she could do to get back at FDR, but she resisted strongly admitting to herself or to the world that he cared about food, that he was a gourmand, and he'd been raised with wonderful food, and it's how he lived or would have lived. And she didn't. Some journalist asked her once, she said, you know, can you tell us the president's favorite dish? She said, no, we're just terrible about food. We don't care what we eat. He cared. So she was fighting down that knowledge all the time. So yes, I think revenge was definitely there. I don't know how close to the surface of her own consciousness it was.
I think that's all of the questions. Just making sure I didn't miss anyone, except of course that there are some wonderful comments about how much people have enjoyed your talk. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Enjoyed every segment. Wonderful book. Great talk. Wonderful talk. Many thanks, Laura. So I think we will end it at that. And I just want to thank you again, Laura. It's been such a pleasure to hear from you. One more question coming in, and that is, what is your next book about? I'm in the kind of the early stages, but it's about food and the making of relationships.
And I'm looking at 4 couples, not what you call romantic couples, although one of them is, but they're pairs of people, friends or mentor, mentee, people close together for one reason or another, where food is a player in that relationship. It makes things happen, or it undoes things, or it sends them in one direction or another. So I'm kind of, it's like What She Ate, only with working with couples. I'm still sort of sifting out what that could possibly mean, but anyway, that's the project.
Well, we're looking forward to that. And I would just like to put in a plug for your previous books too, which as I mentioned to you before the program started, Something from the Oven, Reinventing Dinner in 1950s America, is a really fascinating, delightful book. So go to the bookstore, go to the library, but we're just very, very honored to have had such a distinguished author and culinary historian talk to our group. I just want to let everyone know this is the last official program of our membership year, which, as I mentioned, goes from September to May. But we are looking forward to our theme meal in July. And if any other programs pop up between now and September, you can find information on our website, culinaryhistorians.org. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks to the Ann Arbor District Library. Thanks to Laura Shapiro. And everybody have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.